Since the start of this channel, the 1215 Project, I have mentioned an intention to make a video about the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. And I've kind of just let that slide a little bit. It's something I keep thinking about, and then I don't do, etc. And I guess tonight I'm going to give a go at trying to do that. And as I mentioned at the end of my last video, on the third video on English constitutional development, I'm not going to look at the history so much. What I'm going to look at is the text within the context of the text of the Constitution. And so obviously the place to start such an inquiry, though I will of course eventually get back around to the history part of it, but let's just look at the Second Amendment within the context of itself, because often the NRA, to sort of just make, one hates to make anything totally political, but like, is often sort of accused of being extremist, and they're just, and I want to point out that that's really not true. That, it's the opposite of the case. So, but let's start with you don't have to agree with that to continue listening to this video. Just hear what I have to say. If you disagree with me, you will. So the text of the Second Amendment reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Well, parts of that are fairly obvious. What does it mean for the people to be able to keep and bear arms? Well, they should be able to keep weapons and on certain occasions bear them in public. That probably means that they should bear them when that is civically necessary, but could be in other cases too. Lots of states today have open carry laws, and one that could be a form of bearing arms. Though, I guess I'm a little more traditional. I would tend to think bearing arms means something like, when the civil authority calls you forth, then you bring your arms and show them to people, and the rest of the time you pretty much, you keep them, you use them for hunting or defense of your home or target shooting or whatever. But in any event, that's not really the point. But to give this a little wider context, we might look at those parts of the Constitution that were temporarily similar in their passage, the Ninth and 10th Amendments. And the 10th Amendment is sort of an obvious place to start. "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or the people respectively." So obviously this says something both about the right of the states to have a militia, because obviously there's the whole sort of militia preamble to the Second Amendment, and that is something that the states do have a power over, which is they have a right to have a militia as their sort of principal armed force, though in fact they are also given, there's a clause that gives them a right to naval power as well, as long as they don't get off and start wars on their own. But what is a militia, though? And a militia basically is just an armed force that consists of the people capable of bearing arms. So that means basically, it's a civic force for the defense of the state for the purpose of war. So that means, that the normal weapons of war for that period would be included. And we'll get back to that. What are the normal weapons of war or whatever? But that's basically what the 10th Amendment says about this. And then, of course, there's the 9th Amendment, which should be everyone's favorite amendment. "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." And what that tells us is, it tells us two things. First of all, the rights that are enumerated in the first 8 articles of an amendment in the Bill of Rights are not the sum total of human rights. That each of them probably has a wider application than one might strictly construe them to. And furthermore, that there are many more rights than just the ones that are enumerated in the first 8 articles of the amendment. And therefore, um, you know, there are many. Anyway, my point here is just that that when we look at the Second Amendment, anyway, we should be saying not what is the strictest way we can construe this right, how can we narrow it down to the narrowest possible parameters, but but we should look at it in a broad way, and we're sort of cutting out the broad way of looking at it historically in this context to look at just the rest of the text of the Constitution. So I want to turn now to Article 1, Section 8, which really has quite a good and broad thing to say. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 gives Congress power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of officers and the authority of training the militia in accordance to the discipline prescribed by Congress. So what does that mean? Well, that means that that basically means that Congress has a power to say what weapons the militia should have, and it gives them a power to control the general disposition of the militia. But I think what's interesting in this context is that it was one of the first 4 Congresses. I'm sorry, I'm not really remembering exactly which one it was, but in 1792, they passed the Second Militia Act, which requires that every free-bodied, able white male citizen between the ages of 18 and 45 should, within 6 months of the passage of the act, procure for themselves a musket and a bayonet and flints and gunpowder and lead and so forth and so on, the things that make a musket into a usable weapon. And the musket and bayonet are basically the standard infantry arms of that day. And so just as today, the AR-15 is a semi-automatic version of the M16, which was, until fairly recently, the standard infantry arm of the United States Armed Forces. Now I think they use the M4, but that's just basically a cut-down version of the M16. So it's basically, what is the standard infantry arm of the armed forces? Is basically a slightly less capable form is the standard arm for citizens today. And that's not anything unusual or weird. People are like, oh my God, this is like, these weapons were designed to kill people, and it's just weird that anyone would own them. But actually, it's utterly normal. I'm old enough that I remember the generation after the Second World War, where the M1 Garand rifle was a very common weapon owned by citizens, mostly for hunting, just as, in fact, people don't realize this, the AR-15 is a very useful weapon, not so much for hunting deer, but for many other things like hunting swine and things like that. It's a very good weapon. And of course, people are also owning it because they don't trust the government. Well, the founders of the Republic didn't trust the government either, and there's no reason we should. But my point is that the M1 Garand was a very wide weapon in widespread use when I was a boy, and also very widespread was the Springfield 1906, the 3006, which was the standard U.S. infantry arm of the First World War. So it's just a normal and proper and to be expected thing that the standard infantry arm of the armed forces very rapidly becomes the standard rifle owned by citizens. So you may say that that does not sound surprising or shocking, and that the NRA probably would argue that. Now, they would be more compromising. They would say that you have a right to own a pistol or a shotgun to defend your home, or a shotgun or rifle to go engage in the sport of hunting. But then, that's basically the line of argument they would make. So that doesn't show that the NRA is not extreme. So now I want to turn to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which, among other things, gives Congress the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and to make rules concerning captures on land and water. And it's specifically the part about grant letters of marque and reprisal. Because if you don't know, a letter of marque and reprisal is a license, and it's a license that's granted to a privately owned warship, the owner of a privately owned warship, that license allows him to go and take prizes. That means to capture the commercial and military shipping of a nation with which the country is at war, and then to sell them for a profit. Now, by obvious implication, there's a letter of marque and reprisal would be utterly useless if people did not have a right to own warships. So the marque and reprisal clause really does imply that U.S. citizens have a right to own warships. Now, what is a warship? Well, a warship is a ship with weapons on it. And at the time of the founding, what it had generally were cannon. Now, cannon are a form of field artillery. So if you have a right to own field artillery mounted on a ship, by implication, obviously you must have a right just to own field artillery. And if you can mount field artillery on a ship, then presumably you could mount it on a cart. Now, we do not look at the Constitution and say, well, we're just bound by 250-year-old technology. The First Amendment does not require you to use a flatbed press to print whatever you want. You're allowed to use a rotary press or a copier or the internet. Not TV and radio, but only because that would be free speech, not a free press. And in the same way, obviously, we don't just have a right to use a sailing ship with cannon on them. We have a right to own modern warships, and therefore, by extension, modern artillery, mortars, cannon, rockets, etc. And if you can own a cannon, a piece of artillery of itself, then you can own it mounted on a vehicle. So you get things like armored fighting vehicles and tanks and so on. Now, I think the conclusion from that is, does the NRA make any argument like that? No, they don't. And so the obvious conclusion really is that the NRA is not radical. It's radically compromising in defending our Second Amendment rights. And, so that's just the truth. I mean, the Constitution really does protect your right to own battleships, assuming you can afford one, or cruisers or destroyers or submarines. And, that may shock you. But, the founders of the Republic really were more radical than they are often given credit for. They had a radical view of individual rights. And so, that is what the Constitution really does imply. It does more than imply, in fact, it assumes. I mean, that really is it. Your right to own combat aircraft or battleships or tanks is something that the Constitution just assumes to be true. I mean, really, it's like the not to be mentioned. So as to your right to own rifles or shotguns or pistols, as many of the constitutions of the several states say, to own them for the defense of yourself and the state, is really just, it's obvious. So I hope I haven't given you all heart failure by shocking you too badly. So keep well in this time of illness and have a great day. Bye-bye.